Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes before we start. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the AIA Virtual Building Tours of 2021. My name is Gregory Fonseca. I'm a Director of Architecture at BDP in London, and I also sit on the AIA UK board. Despite COVID, we had a very successful series of virtual building tours in 2020, where we saw MR Pacific headquarters in Seoul, South Korea, 1 Finsbury Avenue, London Bridge Station, the Stratford, and we ended up with Chongqing Industrial Museum. This year we have an exciting lineup as a result of last year's AIA Excellence in Design Awards. We start off the series tonight with Stanton Williams in the Zayed Center for Research into Rare Disease in Children, winner for a large project. We're going to be doing these once a month, the second Thursday of the month, just for reference, and you can see the list of projects that we're going to tour throughout the year, starting today again with Stanton Williams. In February, we'll see Glenn Howells in the English National Ballet, followed by CSK Architects and Cork House in March, and then Zaha Hadid Architects, the Lizzie Soho in April, and then BUA, the Neep Guest House, and then Eric Perry in June, One Fen Court, Ralph Judd, Carnaby Court in July, and then in August, we'll see Morris and Company at Bellevue. But tonight at the Zayed Center for Research into Rare Disease in Children, Stanton Williams reimagined the healthcare environment as a shared civic experience in the heart of London. Designed for Great Ormond Street Hospital and University College London, Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, the 13,000 square meter facility combines pioneering research with clinical care and is the first purpose-built pediatric center of its kind in the world. The BREEAM Excellent project is a compelling example that achieving high environmental aspiration is possible even for a functionally complex building of this nature. Gavin Henderson, Principal Director with Stanton Williams, will guide us through the building tour tonight. Gavin has a focus on the development and culture of cities and the role of public space. Much of Gavin's work involves interventions in sensitive sites and the engagement between architecture and the public realm. Gavin has extensive experience in higher education, science and research, and a particular interest in the interrelationship of these disciplines and urban life. As a principal director at Stanton Williams, he has led a number of the practice's high-profile projects, including the Sterling Prize-winning Sainsbury Laboratory for the University of Cambridge. Recent projects include the expansion of Cambridge Judge Business School, key worker housing for the University of Cambridge, as well as tonight's highlighted building. So with that, I turn you over to Gavin.
Good evening, thank you. Can you see that, Gregory?
Yes,
yep,
perfect.
Great. Well, thank you, Gregory, for that introduction. This evening, as Gregory says, I'm going to talk to you about the Zayed Center for Research, which is very much a one-of-a-kind project. As Gregory noted, it's the world's first purpose-built pediatric center for research and treatment of rare disease. Now, it would be really wonderful to be able to take you all around the building in person, but tonight we have a rather different opportunity in the current context. So what I'm planning to do is to first explain something of the ideas and background behind the building, then a little bit about how we developed some key elements of the design, and then take you around the building itself. It's a project of many different facets, but I hope that what will come across is what we saw as particularly important. I think in our society, healthcare and science are often seen as specialisms which are disconnected from everyday life and from our broader culture. And there's anxiety about research and treatment, what people in laboratories are doing in their white coats. And of necessity, healthcare buildings have become highly specialized technical facilities. What we saw in this project was an opportunity to design based around the way it engages with people, and to reimagine the normally introverted and clinical research and treatment environments as part of our shared urban experience, connected back to everyday life and celebrating the vitally important work that's going on inside the building. Of course, this was all before the current crisis that we face, but today I think those ambitions seem even more relevant than they were at the time. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that a project like this is very much about collaboration, and in this case, a collaboration between our exceptional clients, the world-leading hospital at Great Ormond Street and University College London, Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, and our consultants team and the main contractor. And that's together with later in the project, the input from the funders, without whom the delivery of the building would not have been possible. What I'm going to explain is also very much about the result of the collaborative way we work within our own studio. And these are some of the team members here. It's a very hands-on approach, often making a lot of use of physical models to test almost everything that we design. Slightly obsessive in some instances. This is actually a full-size mock-up of a concrete coffer within the project to try to see what the implications were of fitting acoustic and mechanical installations within the structure. Now, this team, when we started on the project, it was sort of late 2012, moving into 2013. A number of us, including myself, had just completed this building, which is the Sainsbury Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, which won the UK Sterling Prize in 2012. So there were lessons here which were very fresh in our mind and which we brought to our approach to the Zayed Center. And I think central to that, and in common with a lot of research buildings, that was very much about the importance of spaces which promote interaction between scientists, almost choreographing the way you move around the building. The importance about visual connections between different activities. In this case, it was about the laboratories on the left here being strongly connected to the social breakout areas on the right. And the importance of creating a high quality environment partly to attract staff and retain staff, but also to support productivity and well-being. And in this case here, very much integrated into the sustainability strategy, a lot of use of daylight, which is typical of our work, and an approach which you'll see here and recognize again in the Zayed Center, of frequently trying to background the technical services which so often dominate this kind of space and create a more human-focused environment. Now I want to start talking about the Zayed Center itself with this image. It's an artwork by Mark Titchener, based on a quotation from the disabled activist Helen Keller. To give you an idea of scale, it's actually 8.5 meters across, and it's visible from the street and in the entrance area of the building as soon as you enter. And since completion, it's become something of a manifesto for the centre as a whole. This is a project which is about bringing people together, patients, clinicians, research staff, and the urban context. The idea that by working together, we can achieve more. And in particular, it's about supporting and expressing the virtuous circle between research and treatment. These are two more artworks, this time by children in the hospital at a workshop that we helped facilitate, and they really understood this idea about what the building was alike. Was about. The budding architect on the left populating their building with stairs connecting different levels. The image on the right in particular capturing the idea of what's known as bench to bedside research, the feeding of outcomes from treatments back into research and from research direct into treatment. So, you know, on a more concrete level, what does this actually mean for what's in the building? Well, this is our initial client brief diagram. We're bringing together 3 major institutions from Great Ormond Street Hospital and University College London. There's an outpatients department and a series of specialisms working across research workspace, laboratories, and key platform technologies. And these specialisms are reflected in the kind of teams that are occupying the building today and in the current research studies, which include in particular gene therapies and currently, and obviously unanticipated, also work on understanding COVID-19 and its implications. So the building is proving its flexibility in that respect. Supporting this interdisciplinary approach, there was an extensive program of user consultation. There's a key central user group led by Stanton Williams, engagement with 8 separate user groups reflecting different aspects of the building. And these are supported by multiple subgroups and disciplines. Importantly, also including the Young Persons Advisory Group of patients from the hospital. So I think those of you who work on complex buildings will recognize the amount of dialogue that goes into developing a design for a building of this type. And whilst this may look quite dry in this form, of course, it's actually all about people, you know, about engaging with different members of the community, particularly within the hospital. And this is a consultation with patients about their experience of waiting rooms and what they're looking for in that environment. And a very important part of that engagement was through the arts program that one runs throughout Great Ormond Street Hospital and has had a particularly positive input into this, this new building. So what you see here are images from the development of one of the art pieces, which we'll see later in the talk. So it really is a quite complex and unique set of issues that we're dealing with. It's also a very unique site. It's at the heart of London's Bloomsbury Conservation Area, You see it here. We've put on some of the key stations to orientate those of you who know the area. And it's at the center of a cluster of other medical research institutions which form part of London's Knowledge Quarter, which is itself one of the world's densest groupings of knowledge-based industries and research institutions. Very much part of a broader network within the building and a broader network within its context, and then an international network. And sorry, I'll just go back. What you also see here, in front of where the Zayed Centre is, you'll see there's a large green space, which is Coram's Fields, a space which has been dedicated to the well-being for over 250 years. It's now a playground and other facilities. So there's this rather wonderful symbiotic relationship between the building and its contexts. Coram's Fields was originally the site of London's Foundling Hospital. And as well as being a place of care, this was a place where Handel performed music and Hogarth set up London's first public art gallery. So there's this rather suggestive idea about care actually having a public face and being more broadly engaged with urban culture than we would currently see today. Now, our site is the wall on the bottom right-hand corner of this image. This is the site slightly later in the 18th century, and our building is this element here, forming part of a quite formal layout of streets which led up to the Foundling Hospital. Now, the Foundling Hospital itself is long gone, and the site that we're working with was bombed in the Second World War and was very poorly redeveloped by the buildings that you see on the left-hand side there. So by building back onto the original building lines, the project also provided an opportunity to re-establish a coherent streetscape to this part of the conservation area. The two trees on the right in 1912 are the same two trees on the left-hand image in 2012, which I think is rather wonderful, given that the physical built context has changed so much in the interim years. So this is Coram's Fields today, with the centre picked out in yellow. And we saw in this very prominent location and the historic legacy of Coram's Fields an opportunity to engage with the public realm and to celebrate the important but otherwise invisible work that will be going on within the building as part of our contemporary urban culture. The building has an almost civic frontage which faces north over Coram's Fields, but it steps down to the south to really embed itself in this very dense domestic context of the 18th and 19th century buildings. And a key factor of the massing that you see here was the need from the client side to maximize the amount of area that we could develop on the site, but then the control of that developable volume by an analysis of daylighting requirements and rights of light for all of these surrounding buildings. So you've got a higher volume facing Coram's Fields, and it steps back at different levels with different adjacencies at the rear. And that's what you see here. It's a building actually that's best understood in section, really. The higher volume here facing Coram's Fields, but almost, with all these different things going on in the building, a layer cake of different activities. And we looked at different ways of organizing these, but there's a clarity here to the most technical parts of the building being at the lower levels or right at the top, where they have their own discrete plant areas. And what you can see here is we have a double height laboratory at lower ground floor level, right across the principal facade facing the street. There's other technical spaces at that lower ground level. There's 2 floors which are largely outpatients department at ground and first floor. Above that, we have research workspace, and then we have clean rooms which are working on gene and cell therapies, which is Europe's largest clean room facility of its type. And the experience when you're in the building is very much about the relationship between these different activities and between these activities and the external environment. And in particular, this is quite a deep block. It's a building, it's 75 meters long, 35 meters across. So there's a lot of attention into bringing daylight and views into the heart of the building. And that's very much tied to this idea about placing the experience of children's families and staff at the heart of the design, which is about well-being and also reducing stress for patients. And that approach to well-being is closely linked to targets for carbon reductions and sustainability. Things like the approach to daylighting, obviously working across both well-being and the sustainability strategies. The views into the building are as important as the views out. In fact, I think probably as the central concept really is about the visibility of activities from the street. And this is an early design sketch which had already identified very clearly this idea of looking down from the street into that large laboratory at lower ground floor and seeing people entering and moving around the outpatients beyond. So this is very much about trying to demystify the science for the public, but also for the children using the building. And in a way, I think these two images, both from within the building, sum up the project. The scientists in the clean rooms working on gene and cell therapies, and the child in the outpatients department who's looking into an interactive display based around a microscope, which is explaining about genetics and genetic diseases. So it's working for the public and for the people within the building. Now, hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of issues and approach to the building that we're looking at. Before I walk you around the building, I want to give you a flavor of how we develop these ideas. In particular, I think there are a number of important themes: the sense of connectivity between different elements, the balance between quite specific spaces that we've created and the flexibility needed for science. In research, I think the mantra is very often nothing is certain except change. So that sense of adaptability is important. And then the way the facade in particular has been developed in a way that relates to its context and relates the internal activities to what's going on outside. And for us, the way we work is very much about working with simple physical models of different elements and spaces. That's exploring the ways that the spaces are connected, almost in a sculptural way, and testing proportions on physical models that work alongside the IT tools that, of course, we use as for our technical design. And during this process, we're developing a robust language, really, of semi-external materials. And that's also about reinforcing this connection between the inside and outside, and is pulled through even, or perhaps in particular, into the main double height laboratory that you see here. So much of the laboratory is a robust, much of the building is a robust exposed concrete frame. And I think the approach that we bring to this kind of space is very much about using structure as the space forming elements. And here, again, on that double height laboratory, on the upper left hand side is that street level where you'll be looking down into the space. And the whole building at this point is supported on some slender, solid steel billets to maximize the sense of openness. So there's some very carefully considered structural design to achieve these connections. These are those steel billets, rather beautiful connections within the structural frame. So that sculptural use of structure extends throughout the principal communal spaces. So we see these as quite permanent spaces, which carry out the main communal functions and allow you to move through the building. But it's quite important to the understanding of the building to see that these are balanced and that flexibility and adaptability is provided within the more workspace functional areas. And this is a typical approach to those floors with a 9 by 9 meter structural grid and a flat post-tensioned slab to allow for ease of rerunning services in the future. And right at the top of the building, we have the gene and cell therapy clean room area, which is structurally a single space, 70 meters long by 15 meters wide, to allow for complete adaptability for future changes. And that's set back from the main facade and provides very much a crowning element for the building. So I hopefully that gives you an idea about some of the themes we've been looking through the design and construction. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, that main facade. And you can see the setback here of the gene and cell therapy clean rooms, and the way we have a lower volume that relates very much to the datums established by the surrounding masonry buildings, the original Georgian terraces, but also the institutional buildings which now surround Coram's Fields. And it's designed, that facade is designed on the lower volume very much to manage views in and out of the building. And facing Coram's Fields, what we began to develop was a screen of terracotta fins that partially open, open and close according to the functions that are going on behind. Now, I think terracotta is a very beautiful traditional material, but very often contemporary terracotta can have quite an industrial character. So in keeping with the way that we were approaching materials for the building, we were looking to find a way of introducing a more human and tactile quality into this material, slightly more handmade quality, if you like. So what we've done is that each piece is sandblasted by hand, so that the natural variation produced by the human input produces slightly different surface textures across different pieces of terracotta. So what you begin to see is that whilst the color is the same, there's a different level of reflectivity to each piece, and that produces a subtle variation within the facade. And the facade, as you see here, it forms quite a dense screen when looked obliquely, but actually from the interior, it's very much about framing views to the trees in Coram's Fields that face the building. Now then, sitting on top of that lower volume is the clean rooms, and here we were looking to create a much more delicate and reflective structure, so that it really recessed back into the sky behind the building. This does not look like a tall building, but it's quite tall in relation to some of its neighbours. And there was a lot of work looking at how we could introduce different levels of transparency and reflectivity. And what the final design has is a series, it's cladding glass sheets that float in front of the structure. And at different times of day, they look either reflective or transparent, depending on the lighting conditions. And they sit on this lower structure of the terracotta work below, which you can also see is getting steadily lighter, picking up different datums as it moves up the building. And around towards the south of the building, they sit on a much more solid brickwork plinth. And I think what we were trying to do here is relate much more closely to the wall and window architecture of the surrounding streetscape. So we're doing that, but you can also see we have quite wide, deep wall build-ups because of the heavily insulated facades that we are using. So we're exploiting that to create additional interest by pushing and pulling the glazing, sometimes at the back of the wall and sometimes out on the surface of the wall. So that's what you see on the image on the right, which is the side facing the more residential properties. So it's a building that actually has two quite different characters. To the south, it's much more solid and masonry character. It's also helping us a lot with solar gain and with privacy, because you're obviously controlling issues of overlooking. And to the north, it's almost a fully glazed facade with a delicate terracotta screen. But I think what was important to us is that both facades are made out of clay. And clay is what London is made of. It's actually what London is built on. And it's clay and brick and terracotta in different forms that characterize the surrounding conservation area. So we're working with these very traditional materials, but in a more contemporary way that allows the building to sit within its context. So I'm now going to take you on the tour itself, if you like, starting actually from the south. So here the building is on the left, and it forms very much part of the language of the street, with the brick volumes playing with the heights of the surrounding buildings and those clean rooms set back from this facade. But as you move up towards the north of the building, you can see here how the terracotta screen is very much a loggia that's almost pushed into this solid clay volume, and it opens up to the right onto the trees of Coram's Fields. And those fins give a solidity to the building in the oblique views, which is what you usually experience. That's how you experience the building, because it's along a street. And that's quite important within the context of quite solid buildings within the conservation area. But of course, actually this facade is glazed behind those screens. What they're doing is they are concealing some activities, but deliberately revealing others. So we've got this very large window looking down into the lower ground floor laboratory. And then up above that on first floor, we've got this very large glazed opening into the outpatients waiting areas. And as you approach the building, and most people, well, a lot of people will approach the building from this direction, which is the west side, approaching from the hospital, which is on the adjacent urban block. The window really is the element that draws you round to the main entrance of the building, and allows you to begin to look down into the laboratory and see the activity that's going on, and in places actually look right the way through the building. So you can see that your route will be following that window around. And there's really an exceptional degree of transparency to this building at this level. Here, this is standing on the street, looking across the laboratory to the outpatients entrance area. And I think we were very fortunate here, because a lot of us are familiar with designing buildings that aim to be transparent and finding them less transparent than we'd hoped. But because this is north facing, the glass doesn't have lots of solar control coatings, and we do actually manage to obtain a good degree of transparency looking into the building. So when you step back, obviously at this point you do see through between the fins, and you can understand this idea of a loggia with different layers of space moving back from the street edge. Even at the workspace floors, we don't have workspaces pushed up against the glass. You can always circulate behind this loggia so that the views become something that is can be enjoyed by all the people who are on those particular floors. So this is a study model we did during the design process, but it gives you a fairly clear idea of the ground floor of the building. You enter on a bridge across that double height laboratory. That's a single entrance for researchers and for patients and their families. That was very important from the client perspective, in order to this idea of a single identity and not separating people out within the center. And then once in, you move either right to the outpatients department or left to the more research areas of the building, each of which has its own atrium. So it's a building with a single entrance, but two independent but connected hearts, if you like. So this is standing on that bridge, and as you stand on the bridge, there's a real sense of the interior of the building being connected to the street, an engagement with the urban life throughout, really, the ground floor. And then if I stand on the bridge and look the other way, here you see Mark Titchener's artwork, actually within the laboratory itself, and on the wall that extends back from the street facade, so visible as well to passers-by. And that laboratory is characterized also by the connection to the street up on the level above, and by the north light that it brings, fantastic working light for these spaces. So there's a real generosity that you can see to this space. I think it was at the point when we established this as an idea that it really unlocked the site, because it enabled us to put primary working spaces at the lower ground floor, which we needed to do to fit within the envelope that we could develop. And we wanted those spaces to be, this high quality environment with daylight and views. And so there's always that kind of working between squeezing things into the site, but then really working hard on the quality of the space that we are creating. So as you go towards outpatients, you're looking down on the people who are working on cures that are going to be part of the treatments. It's a building that's very much focused around providing a sort of tactile, warm, non-clinical environment wherever possible, using a lot of timber. This is a tour by Vocal Eyes within that space, the charity for partially sighted people, which was actually a particularly, I think, rewarding tour to be part of, because we could really understand, how people responded, not simply in a visual way, but in literally a more tactile way to the design. So this is about engagement with the building, but it's also about engagement with the science. In this case, this is an interpretation of a kind of DNA array that's used in the research. It's actually the genetic map of a particular disease that was identified early on in research. And here, these are interactive installations explaining the science to younger children within the outpatients department. a different form of engagement. This is with artwork here in the small terrace garden that we created for the outpatients department. So this is the ground floor plan of the building. We've come through the main entrance, we've turned right towards the outpatients area, which is the pink part of this plan. There's a central waiting area which allows views right the way through the depth of the building. And that arrangement is replicated on the first floor, where it's complemented by these views from the north-facing waiting areas overlooking Corum's fields. And there's also a very important visual connection through an opening back into the research atrium and the research part of the building. So it's all about forming these links. Consultation rooms are inboard from the facades to allow patients to get most benefit from the views to the exterior, and have discrete connections for staff between the outpatients department and the research areas of the building. So this is that first floor waiting area with its small scale atrium. As you can see, it's one language of materials throughout this building. It's very much about creating a single unified identity, and also not condescending to the young people who are using the building, who are in fact from a very wide range of age groups. In common with the Sainsbury laboratory, you can also see here there's very little in the way of visible services in these primary spaces. Consultation rooms are very simple clinical spaces, but I think very importantly they are generous enough for families who can gather around a table for consultations, and they all have borrowed light from the waiting areas outside. And as you wait in those areas, you can watch the life of the street outside, engage with the exterior and with the landscape beyond. So this is that large first floor window we were looking at, which forms this kind of loggia out, looking onto Corum's fields. And this is the kind of view that you're looking at when you're looking beyond. Here, this is a child who's actually in the outpatients department, but looking back into the research atrium through that visual connection that I showed on plan. And the child's engaging with Kinds of Life, which is an interactive installation, one of the artworks within the building, by Random International. And it's based around the idea that curiosity underpins both science and the way that children explore their world through play. It was what those early images I showed about the arts consultation were about. There's drawing on ideas about the red balloon, the 1950s film, this intriguing object that has actually proved to be very intriguing both for patients and for scientists. It moves around the space, responding to the way people move within the building. It comes closer and it pulls away from them. And it's situated within the main atrium of the research area, which is a space that makes visual and physical connections between this layer cake of different activities I was talking about, and also provides opportunities for interaction between staff, particularly in the way that they move around using these very visible staircases. And you can see it's a very open building to either side. A lot of the groups and teams of people moving into this building had been in quite isolated, separate buildings. So this is all about bringing people together and reducing the siloing effect that can happen when you're in separate buildings or more cellular types of buildings. And the space has become a real heart for this building and in fact for the wider community, and has been used for a number of different cultural events, which I think we hadn't anticipated. But here it's a performance by choir within that main space. And this is the same space with a dance by Studio Wayne McGregor taking place at that lower level. So this idea of art, engagement, event, and science and care are all kind of brought together in these kinds of activities. You can see in section how that space connects different parts of the building, particularly the different research areas. I think conventionally, one would usually try to put laboratories and workspace side by side on the same floor. Here, we're arranging them vertically because of the site. So actually, this vertical connection becomes particularly important. You can also see here how the outpatients department also faces onto that space. And there are a series of collaboration spaces that are placed at key points connected by those staircases to actually draw people around the building and give them places where they can interact with their colleagues. So in plan, I'm just going to work my way gradually up this section. This is the lower ground floor. The principal laboratory spaces in yellow, these all have either daylight from the exterior or windows onto that atrium space. And the majority of the other spaces at this level are either equipment or support rooms or tissue culture rooms, spaces where light was less important. This is a typical workspace floor. And you'll see that this is largely open plan with agile working to try to break down again the siloing between different institutions and research teams. A relatively small number of cellular offices on this floor, which is quite a culture change for research institutions. And here we have the cafe and the external terrace for socializing, interacting with colleagues, exchanging ideas. And then at the top of the building, we have the clean room facility, which is actually, slightly ironically, that very large space is actually the most cellular space within the building, with a very complex flow of clean and dirty activities for people and materials, the clean rooms being the yellow area on the left-hand side here. So I'm going to actually just illustrate that movement up through the building, which connects the research side of what's going on. So we have the principal laboratories with the daylight and views out to Coram's Fields at the lower ground level, other laboratory spaces which open onto the atrium space, the stairs which are more solid at that lower level, but then become more delicate as they go up, and they connect through to the research workspace areas, which are quite simple, hard-working spaces, but all characterized by these views all the way through the building, so you get daylight from the atrium and views out to the outside. And on this floor also we have this rather beautiful south-facing cafe terrace environment, which takes advantage of some of the trees that are built that exist within the interior of this urban block. So that is all about breakout and the ability to meet and exchange ideas with your colleagues. And then, of course, at the top of the building, this is a much more secluded, secure area, and much more driven by the technical controlled environments required by the clean rooms. In fact, if we were walking around the building, I don't think we would get into this. So this is actually gives you a really good idea of what's happening here, which are really quite remarkable treatments. This is a manufacturing facility, so they're actually working on treatment at a genetic level, which will then be taking genetic material from patients and then reinserting it back into them. So it's really quite remarkable work that's going on in here. And yeah, I'm going to end here. The building is in use, obviously slightly differently over the past year, like we anticipated, like many other buildings. And we'll be looking to draw lessons and understand more from it as it is more fully active. But I think it's very rewarding, even at this point, to see some of the initial feedback from patients and their families about their engagement with the Zayed Centre and the life-changing work that it's doing. So I hope I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I'm going to end there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. That was really an inspirational tour through the building. I think it's a beautifully crafted building. It's quite interesting because there's nothing that gave me the sense of clinical nature as you took me through the tour. So I applaud that effort because it's nothing very clinical other than the obvious equipment, etc. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the Q&A, the tab at the bottom. But I'll start off with a couple of questions of my own. You mentioned, well, you talked very, very early on about the section and how it really is a very clear diagram of the scheme. But I also noticed that when you showed this elevation, the northern elevation, clear, almost straight on, it also, I think, speaks to the same ideology in terms of the concept. You can see each of the uses are quite clear and shown in elevation. So my question, though, it's the laboratory or the space that really has that exposure on the street and the interaction with the urban grain, etc. The two-story space, it's a very generous endeavor, I would suggest, for that kind of space. I would imagine that the client, you had to either sell that idea or that was part of the brief. Can you just speak a little bit about, because it's a beautiful space and I love the connectivity between that space, which normally you wouldn't see as part of the scheme. It'd be tucked away somewhere where nobody can really see it. So can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It wasn't part of the brief. I mean, I think we actually spent a long time on a detailed feasibility study for the building before we got heavily into the design, and a lot of that was working on this three-dimensional puzzle of how we could fit, all these different activities onto this site within the constraints of quite a tight planning envelope, because it is very sensitive. And as I said, it became clear fairly early on that we needed to develop two basements. And we looked at different ways of distributing activities around the building. And in fact, a lot of the early studies had laboratory space and write-up workspace on the same floors, on multiple floors through the building, which is a complex and expensive thing to do on a building like this, because you've got a lot more threading of services around. So we gravitated towards this idea of the lower ground floor being a major research space, and the clean rooms, which do need to be secure and slightly more isolated, being away from the street at the top. Now there's a real challenge there for ourselves, conceptually. People working at lower ground floor level, we do start to worry about daylight and the quality of the environment that we're creating. And also, there is a challenge, I think, with the scientists they also don't want to really be put in a dark, undaylit space. So we came up quite early in the design with this idea of the double height laboratory, and you could sense a sort of there was a relief, I think, from the client body that actually, yes, we could get everything in the site, and this was the move that really unlocked the use of that lower ground floor for high quality research space, and immediately people bought into it. I think there's another thing to this, that it's a very important site for the hospital because it's immediately adjacent to their main campus, and a lot of the priority was on maximizing the use of the site. And it was as we began to discuss it that this public facing aspect of the site came to the fore and became, more important, and certainly an important part of the design development. But I can remember discussions with some of the senior clinicians about, what's going to attract people about, what's going to be the, if you like, the wow factor. And it's a hard-working building. It's not like in Australia, there's a children's hospital that's got a meerkat farm within it. That's the wow factor. We didn't have the brief for a meerkat farm. We don't have the brief or space for a large public exhibition area either. But what we did have was the activity. And so we said, well, why not celebrate the activity and make, what's the wow factor about this building is the science that's going on within it. So let's celebrate that. And I think everyone, bought into that. So the double height laboratory is about quality of space at the lower ground level, but it's about very much that public facing celebration, which became of the work that's going on in the building.
Well, thank you. Again, I think that's really, it kind of sets the building apart as a laboratory and being able to sort of have that connectivity. I'll just ask one more question and then I'll open it up to the participants. The one thing that strikes me a little bit is you look at this elevation, this facade, the massing on this side. I'm just curious in terms of planning terms, because when you showed the eastern elevation or the eastern approach, it seems to really, scale-wise, it really seemed to fit in. I'm not suggesting this doesn't quote unquote fit in, but it does look, in terms of that streetscape, in terms of scale, a little bit, let's just say, more aggressive, if you will. Can you speak a little bit to were there any planning issues with respect to the overall massing, in particular on facing the park?
Well, Coolm's Fields is quite, I think, quite interesting historically, because of course it started with a big institution in the centre and with residential properties around the perimeter. The Foundling Hospital was demolished in the 1930s, and actually all the residential properties surrounding the main part of the space have also gone now and have been replaced by institutions around the perimeter, either medical or academic. So this building is actually very much in proportion with the other institutional buildings that frame Coram's Fields. And I think the challenge we had was that, yes, this is appropriate for that public space. But then behind the rear of the site to the south, we have much closer proximities with smaller buildings. So it was balancing those two elements and working out where, from which angles you see the taller volume, which is the gene and cell therapy volume at the top. So you're not so much aware of it on that approaching street that I showed, because of its set back from the facade. Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A that have come up. One is, I'd say, a typical kind of question. What is the construction cost, if you're able to share that information?
There's a published project cost, which is £90 million, but obviously that is not the construction cost, because it includes all sorts of other things and decanting, moving fees, everything else. I think it's always difficult in a building like this to actually if one's trying to develop a construction cost and a per square meter cost, and I think you mentioned this is a 13,000 square meter building, it's almost impossible to come up with a meaningful way of looking at that, because we have some spaces like the clean rooms, which are probably the most expensive kind of environment that you could create, and we have other spaces like the workspaces, the office type environments, which are actually deliberately quite simple, cost effective space. As with any medical project, any healthcare project for the health service, there are a lot of cost constraints within this, which we're working to. So a blended rate, or trying to understand how much the building costs without breaking it down into different components is I think always a difficult one, in fact.
Challenging. Okay. Quality control, concrete, there's the level of finish is quite high. Can you speak a little bit about quality control, and in particular with respect to the concrete and certainly the terracotta, because I think the terracotta is also quite beautifully done as well.
It was, I mean, this was a design and build contract with Skanska, but we designed the building for the client pretty much fully up to stage 4. So there was a lot of control by ourselves and the client about the design of the building, and we were then novated to Skanska. So we continued to be fully engaged with the development of details with the subcontractors throughout the project. So I think that level of engagement is key, and I think we particularly enjoy and think it's important. What's important is the actual engagement with the subcontractors, not just the main contractors. So a lot of work on our side spent with the terracotta manufacturers, with the other key subcontractors through the building, and a lot of input on site, looking at quality control issues. I think the concrete is good. It's not really intended to be exceptionally refined. The concrete frame had to go up quite quickly, actually, because speed was a big cost driver on the project. But what you see is, it's robust, it feels appropriate, it's well done. There was some remedial work to deal with a small number of defects, but otherwise I think it's a good quality concrete within the main areas, and I would say it's just about that ongoing engagement from the architectural side throughout the construction process. And I would also say ongoing engagement from the client throughout the construction process. And on this project, I think, and on many others, I think where we find there's a funder involved, they also have an interest in the final quality of the end result, and that's is also, I think, a positive thing for most buildings.
Okay, I'm gonna give you 2 more questions, and you can answer them in whatever order you choose. The first one is about the art, the commissioning of the art. Sort of what stage was that during the design process, and what was yourself and/or the architectural team's engagement like in that process? And then the second question is the BREEAM Excellent, and I mentioned early on it was a project of this complexity. It's often difficult to impossible to get that kind of BREEAM rating. If you could just maybe touch a little bit on the sustainability credentials and how you achieve those as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think the art program was a very interesting and rewarding part of the scheme, and Great Ormond Street Hospital have a fantastic team at Gosh Arts who we work with very closely, and they commission artwork within the hospital and events within the hospital, and they were steering the art program within this building. And we were very much part of that team throughout the process. So there were, briefs written, interviews of artists, and then, presentations to a team of us that from the hospital and the client side, actually from the funder team. That the funder wasn't involved early on in the project, but was involved by the time we got to look at the artwork, which I can't remember exactly when that was, but it was some way down the design development of the building itself. So we then worked on how it integrated into the architecture, and I think it's added a great deal. And obviously there was there's an element of coordination to do, particularly on that random international piece, which obviously has technical infrastructure supporting it. So yes, we were involved throughout all of that, really, and I think it's been a very positive part of the scheme, and a very well received part of the scheme. The sustainability side, well, I think we would always approach this from a fabric first approach, as I think probably all would as architects. So it's not waving sustainability plug-ons all around the scheme. There's a lot of simple things that are done well, very energy efficient facades, high levels of insulation. That brick facade to the south really is doing a very serious job, in that any more opening on that side was giving us lots of problems with solar gain and overheating, and would have led to more cooling. So it is very much about fabric first, I think, and then a lot of use of daylight, very efficient lighting as well. And then we have a combined heat and power plant, and a very energy efficient selection of systems. And there's a large photovoltaic array on that roof where it's not overshadowed from the south. So that's giving us our renewable energy. And I should say here, this is working, very closely with Hawley in particular, who were working on the MEP of the building and also on the sustainability side. So I think it's a lot of, perhaps non-glamorous things like fume-covered heat recovery, but they're all actually getting us to hit these targets. And it is a 37% increase, improvement on building regulations, which is slightly above the London plan targets. But of course, we were designing this before the targets, and we decided we would anticipate and meet those in any case. So it's that kind of approach that we brought to the building.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to end the tour on that note, and I want to thank Gavin for your time and the really inspiring tour and following up commentary as well. And I also want to thank all who've attended tonight, and I look forward to seeing, or well, sort of seeing you all in the next tour next month. Again, thank you very much, Gavin, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you very much.